A German officer rushes into the war room, report in hand. Hitler looks up from the map. The silence is heavy. The red lines that marked his central defense are gone, thousands of soldiers lost. Communications severed, the enemy on every flank. There, in front of paralyzed generals, he understands there is no central front anymore. But what was said in that instant? What orders left the bunker when the truth finally arrived? And why did no one dare contradict what the map was already screaming? Welcome to Deep History. Tell us where you're watching from. I'd really like to know. On the 22nd of June 1944, exactly 3 years after the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army opened Operation Bagration. Its target was Army Group Center, the key German formation holding the middle of the Eastern Front. This army group stretched for more than 700 kilometers across Belarus, over forests, marshes and rivers that seemed ideal for a strong defense. Field Marshal Ernst Busch commanded roughly 800,000 men, grouped into the 3rd Panzer Army, the 9th Army, the 4th Army, and the 2nd Army. Infantry divisions manned reinforced bunkers, minefields and trench systems, while scattered panzer units supported them, though they were fewer than German doctrine truly required. Cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev and Bobruisk were declared fortresses, and orders from Berlin were clear. They were to be held to the last man. On large situation maps in the OKH war rooms and in Hitler's Wolf's Lair, the central front appeared as a firm red spine, linking Army Group North in the Baltic to formations further south. And to German planners this line was the backbone of their entire eastern position. Intelligence reports, however, were badly flawed. German analysts saw Soviet troop movements, but judged the main build-up to be in the south, toward Ukraine, and the oil fields of Romania. In Belarus, Soviet radio traffic seemed routine, and Colonel Reinhard Gellen's Fremdheerast estimated only a fraction of the Soviet strength actually present. In reality, for Soviet fronts were gathering, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts, together with the 1st Baltic Front, assembling more than 1.6 million men, around 5,800 tanks and assault guns, tens of thousands of guns and mortar, and strong air support that the German High Command failed to see in full. Hitler's doctrine of rigid defense dictated the rest. No step back, no voluntary withdrawal. That was the rule. He kept key panzer reserves in the south, convinced a decisive battle would come there, and reinforcements to Army Group Center were limited and late. On paper, the central line looked solid, but in practice, it was about to be tested in a way it could not endure. In the early hours of the 22nd to the 23rd of June, at 3:45, the storm broke. An artillery barrage of unprecedented intensity erupted along the entire front of Army Group Center, as more than 10,000 Soviet guns and Katyusha rocket launchers fired almost simultaneously. Forests were shredded, roads were cratered beyond use, and telephone lines were torn apart. Soviet Il-Sturmovik aircraft attacked German anti-aircraft batteries and strongpoints, and behind the artillery screen, infantry and tanks began to move. At Vitebsk, General Georg Hansen's 3rd Panzer Army came under heavy assault from the 3rd Belarusian front. At Orsha, Hans Jordan's 9th Army was hit by the 2nd Belarusian front. Further south, Mogilev and Bobruisk came under similar pressure. Entire German companies were destroyed in trenches before they could mount a coordinated response. Radio stations received overlapping, broken messages, breaches reported, enemy armor sighted, artillery silent or overrun, and urgent calls for air support. The Luftwaffe, weakened by fuel shortages and losses, could offer little more than scattered reconnaissance flights. The opening shock was devastating, but it was only the first phase, and what came next would change everything. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler received the first messages that morning. He marked small adjustments on the war map with his pencil and, at first, Bagration still looked to him like a diversion. He believed the main Soviet effort would fall in the south, and orders went out to Bush, hold every position and counterattack locally with available panzer reserves. On the ground, that order ran into reality. Army Group Center had fewer than 500 operational tanks across its vast front, many low on fuel and short of ammunition. Belarusian partisans, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, struck at the German rear. Rail lines were blown up, bridges destroyed, supply columns ambushed on forest roads, and ammunition depots went up in flames at night. By the end of the first day, Vitebsk was effectively encircled, with roughly 28,000 German troops cut off there. Supplies were short, communications unreliable, and requests for permission to withdraw came in. But from Berlin, the answer was simple and final: no retreat. As Soviet operations unfolded, their depth became clear. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front, had argued for a double breakthrough and now pressed attacks that not only smashed German front lines, but swung around them. Multiple pockets formed, and entire regiments and divisions found themselves behind Soviet spearheads instead of in front of them. In Vitebsk, Hitler's fortress, order sealed the fate of the garrison, as General Hansen was told to hold to the last. Over the following days, roughly 32,000 men were compressed into a shrinking perimeter, pounded continuously by artillery and assaulted again and again by Soviet tanks and infantry. In Orsha, the 9th Army tried to hold a key transport hub on the Maskirovka highway. For 2 days, German units fought bitterly to keep the route open, but engineers, under pressure, destroyed some bridges too soon. Forward units were left stranded on the wrong bank of rivers, and the line there began to break apart as well. At Bobruisk, the XXXV Panzer Corps became the center of a huge encirclement, with urban fighting raging in the streets. When German forces attempted to break out at night, they ran into Soviet anti-tank guns and minefields, and air attacks tore into columns of vehicles trying to escape, so that main roads turned into corridors lined with burned-out wrecks. Back at higher headquarters, information was incomplete and delayed. Telegrams from OKH demanded accurate situation reports by division, but messages returning from the front often listed units as out of contact or reorganizing. Gaps in the front could not be fully mapped in real time, and yet Hitler pressed his staff. Where are my tanks? Why no counterstroke? His focus, however, remained divided, as Soviet deception operations, including feints toward the Pripyat marshes and the south, still fed the idea that Ukraine might be the real objective, so valuable reserves stayed away from Belarus. Soviet Maskirovka tactics played a key role in this confusion. Fake radio nets mimicked non-existent Soviet armies in the south. Dummy tanks and aircraft were laid out to fool aerial observers, and empty trains ran back and forth to suggest large troop movements. Meanwhile, the real forces advancing on Army Group Center maintained strict radio silence wherever possible, and by the time the pattern became visible, it was too late to shift major reserves. As days passed, the German central position began to fragment. Minsk, the main communications and supply hub for Army Group Center, became the focus of converging Soviet thrusts. The 4th Army, under General von Tippelskirch, found itself trapped in an enormous pocket east of the city, between the Berezina River and the advancing Soviet fronts. German troops tried repeated breakouts under cover of darkness, moving along forest tracks, across marshy ground, and through devastated villages. But many of these efforts ended in disaster as Soviet artillery and aircraft struck retreating columns and partisans ambushed survivors in wooded areas. On the 28th of June, Minsk fell after hard urban fighting. By then, the 4th Army had ceased to exist as a coherent force, and tens of thousands of prisoners had been taken. Soviet troops seized fuel, ammunition and equipment from captured depots, and that material would feed their continued advance. Bush was relieved of his command and replaced by Walter Model, a defensive specialist sent to collapsing fronts. but even he could not conjure divisions out of nothing. By the time he arrived, much of Army Group Center was already gone. Photographs and reconnaissance reports reaching the Wolf's Lair showed a bleak picture: roads jammed with destroyed vehicles, bridges blown or captured, forest lines broken with smoke rising for kilometers, and river crossings clogged with wreckage and bodies. Hitler studied these images carefully, yet insisted that a firm line could be restored further west. More orders went out to establish new positions, counterattack where possible, and hold key road nets, but the means to carry out those orders was steadily fading away. By early July, the scale of the disaster could no longer be disguised. On the 3rd of July 1944, at a midday briefing in the Wolf's Lair, the full reports on Army Group Center lay on the table. They showed that approximately 25 divisions had been destroyed or reduced to shadows, and that around 400,000 men were gone, killed, wounded, captured or missing. The map of the Eastern Front looked radically different. Where there had been a continuous central line, there was now a vast gap, and Soviet forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers into what had been the German rear. The German armies in the north and south were no longer solidly linked. Witnesses later recalled Hitler leaning over the map as an aide wiped away the red markings representing whole German corps. Hitler then spoke in a flat voice. This means the complete destruction of Army Group Center, and reportedly asked, "Where are our men?" The whole of Army Group Center is destroyed. Field Marshal Keitel tried to offer some reassurance, speaking of units regrouping, but Hitler cut him off. "Gentlemen, the war is lost." There was no outburst, no overturned table, only silence and the sound of chairs moving as the briefing ended. Even after that remark, orders for continued resistance went out. Model was instructed to hold new lines, to launch local counterattacks and to buy time. But those commands were now being issued into a reality that did not match the maps on the walls. The central defensive system that had once anchored the Eastern Front had vanished, and no amount of rhetoric could bring back the formations that had been destroyed. In the months and years after the war, captured documents and testimony clarified the picture. Operation Bagration had been prepared with extensive deception, strong partisan support, and overwhelming material superiority. German intelligence had underestimated Soviet strength and misread Soviet intentions, and Hitler's refusal to permit withdrawals had turned threatened positions into killing grounds. For Germany, the loss of Army Group Center meant the permanent loss of the central sector of the Eastern Front and the destruction of many of its best remaining units. For the Soviet Union, it opened the road toward Poland, the Vistula River, and, ultimately, the borders of Germany itself. From that summer onward, the question was no longer whether the Red Army could reach Berlin, but how long it would take. Another silent page of the war finally comes to light. Continue through our archive of forgotten operations. Share your thoughts about this operation in the comments. Subscribe, leave your like, and share this video with 2 people you remembered while watching.